Oh, gosh. Well, Jana, I did it again. That's about the 86th time that I've done that. And I didn't unmute my mic. I unmuted the wrong mic. So you would not believe, Jana, how many times we have done that. And the side chat is just going, mute, mute. Hey, Josh, mute. So yes, there we go. I am special. Let me look at the yep, okay. Yep, I think I'm sorry, everybody. I'm special. This is what happens when Megan leaves. See, when Megan leaves, everything falls apart. So let's try that again. I'm Dr. Josh, Digital Hammurabi. I have Dr. Jana Matuszak with me today. Dr. Matuszak and I, you mind if I call you Jana? Is that okay?
Not at all. Please do call me Jana. Everything else would be very weird.
Yeah, that's right. I was going to call you the Right Reverend Matuszak, but I thought that was a little too formal. So, no, Jana and I go pretty far back. I spent a year in Tübingen, Germany, and Jana was there, and she was a very gracious hostess, and it was a lot of fun. So we reached out to her to ask if she would donate an hour of her time to come on and just sort of share her expertise with us. And you know, there are times, Jana, that, and I'm sure that you go through this as well. But when you think, boy, I'm really doing pretty well in my field, and then you meet somebody else in your field and you go, man, I really suck at what I do. And yes, Jana was someone that brought about that feeling in me. So Jana's exceptional at what she does. She's a brilliant Assyriologist. And so actually, Jana, if you wouldn't mind just taking a minute or two and sort of introducing yourself to the audience and kind of letting them know a little bit about you and your background.
Sure. Thank you very much for having me. I think that's going to be great fun. I haven't actually seen you since you were in Tübingen. Mm-hmm. That's been a while.
It has.
So thank you very much for having me here. I hope the noise from the street isn't too bad. You tell me if I should close the window. Right, about me. I'm right now in London. I started a new position at �𝑀, the School of Oriental and African Studies of the University of London, in September last year. So I've almost finished my first year here in London as lecturer in ancient Near Eastern studies. So that's what I'm doing right now here in London. Before that, you've mentioned it, I was in Tübingen. I actually did most of my studies in Tübingen, except for a year here in London as an undergraduate, and I spent some time in Bern in Switzerland as well. How did I end up here, perhaps, is a question one might ask. I actually never thought I would ever study ancient languages. I had Latin at school and I hated it. And I never thought I'd end up doing ancient languages ever in my life. But I did come up with the crazy idea I'd want to be an archaeologist. And 3-4 weeks into studying archaeology, I realized that's not what I want to do at all. Let's go for ancient languages.
Man, it's hot outside. I don't want to do that.
So, yeah, I guess I had these romantic fantasies of, you know, being somewhere in the desert and discovering stuff. And I still like discovering things, but maybe in the library or in nice museums and not in the desert.
Right. In the air conditioning really is the key here, I think, at least for me.
Exactly. So yeah, my background would be I studied ancient Near Eastern studies, Assyriology, as my major subject, mainly at Tübingen University. That's where I graduated, but also some archaeology. I did continue archaeology for 5 years. Then I did my PhD with Konrad Volk and Pascal Attinger in Tübingen. I think that's what we're mainly going to talk about, right? Mm-hmm. Then I spent 3 years at the University of Jena in Germany as an assistant to Manfred Krebernick. and actually one of these small little university towns in Germany, but it does have its own cuneiform collection, which was really nice. So I could just go downstairs and look at the tablets. And now I'm right next to the British Museum, so that's slightly bigger. But the access is less immediate. Obviously, I didn't have a key. Yeah.
Well, fantastic. No, I'm excited. And in fact, Megan was the one that suggested that we see if you could come on, and I thought, oh my gosh, why didn't I think of that earlier? Because I mean, I tend to, it's nice to have kind people in the field that are very knowledgeable to come on and spend some time with us. So I really think you and other people that we bring on the show are a good face for people in academia. That I think so many people in our audience, their experience with academics is sort of the ivory tower, sort of snobby, and I think by doing these types of interactions, it becomes very clear to people that no, they're not all like that. And so
no, I'm currently slightly sunburned for spending part of the day outside. So.
Oh God.
Very down to earth.
Well, so let's talk. And what I want to do, everybody, is I want to go for about 45 minutes because Jana's time is obviously very valuable. So I wanted for her to talk a little bit about her dissertation and some of the things that she's, that she's worked on since receiving her PhD. And then we'd leave, 10 or 15 minutes, if that's okay with you, Jana, for some Q&A from the audience. So if you do have questions, it might be better to hang on to them, like maybe jot them down as you're watching, and then toward the end, put them in the side chat and tag me at Digital Hammurabi, because I'm afraid that I'll not be able to find them if you do it too early. So I don't have Megan here. Megan normally copies and texts the questions to me, so I don't have that today. So can you give us a brief overview of your dissertation? In particular, the text that you analyzed, and kind of talk about, and maybe put it in broad, popular level terms so that we can all follow you.
I'll try my best. Stop me or correct me. So the main goal of my dissertation was actually to make the first edition of a particular Sumerian literary text, which in modern parlance has the terribly unevocative title "Two Women Be." Goes back to the early
it's so true.
years of Sumerological scholarship. We just call all these texts "Two Women A, B, whatever, dialogue 1, 2, 3, and nobody has any idea how fun, how exciting, how cool the texts are behind these weird titles. So yeah, the text I was working on was called "Two Women Be," unfortunately. But the content is much better than the title, I'd say. So this text had never been properly reconstructed before. So the Sumerian text, it was unknown. And since we didn't have the complete Sumerian text for a long time, it was also impossible to translate it into modern languages. So my main task actually was to reconstruct the Sumerian text, because we don't have one single cuneiform tablet that contains it all. So I spent much of my first year traveling around. That was the fun part, I'd say, to various museums and collections in Europe and America to find relevant manuscripts, as we call them, piece it together, and then translate it, so that for the first time this text comes to life. That was the main idea.
If I could pause, can I pause you for just a second, just so that we all understand? So when you say you have to piece it together, can you just sort of tell them a little bit about, I'm sure a lot of the audience does know, but just in case, why that's necessary? You said that we don't have a tablet,
Exactly.
you know,
Mm.
what kind of material are you talking about that we're working with? And why don't we have an entire tablet that has the whole composition on it?
Right, I was going to get
Oh, I'm
there.
sorry.
No, 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 no. Thanks for reminding me.
That was a very
So
kind way of saying that.
not at all.
Thanks for reminding me, Josh.
So it doesn't just concern the text I've been working on, but pretty much every work of Sumerian literature that has been preserved, more or less, has been written down by school children, schoolboys, as part of their scribal education. So they would learn first how to write cuneiform, and I know you have some fantastic educational videos at Digital Hammurabi, so I'm sure people know more or less how to go about cuneiform. And then they would proceed, and in the most advanced stage of the scribal curriculum, when they can write cuneiform fairly well and they've learned quite a bit of Sumerian, which was a dead ancient language to them, very unlike their own mother tongue, then they would start getting acquainted with Sumerian literature, because that was prestigious and important culturally for them. And when they try to come to grips with these difficult literary texts written in a language that was very unlike their own mother tongue, they would first start out by writing down or separating, breaking texts up into chunks. Because the text I was working on had 230 lines in total. That's medium size for Sumerian literature, I'd say. So they wouldn't start writing out 230 lines of text in one go. They would break it up and write, say, 20 to 40 lines every day, memorize them, and once they've memorized the entire text, working on these little extracts, they would write it down once in total. So we have different shapes and sizes of cuneiform tablets. We have these small extract tablets, and then I also have a couple of big tablets. They're a bit like book size, with 6 columns, 3 on each side, that used to contain the entire text. The problem is none of these big tablets that used to contain the entire text are completely preserved. So they're always broken somewhere. But of course, they're very helpful. So what I did was first, of course, collect every single tablet that was already known to contain this text. And then I would basically transliterate every line of cuneiform that was preserved on the tablets, and then kind of see where they overlap with other tablets. And that way I was able, in the end, to reconstruct the entire text. So working from tablets that have lots of text preserved to small, tiny fragments, and kind of put them in the right place. So in the end, I'd have what we call a score transliteration, a bit like musical scores. So for every line of music, you have the different, not the different instruments, but the different manuscripts. And then they fill each other's gaps, ideally. Also, all these Sumerian texts are transmitted anonymously. So we don't have an author for them, which means if we don't know who the author was, we will never find the original text. And it's even unclear if the person or the persons that composed this text ever wrote it down, or whether it was a kind of, first of all, an oral transmission and then later written down. These are very kind of tricky questions. So that's why we always work with as many manuscripts as we have, in order to then ideally find enough of these tablets to fill in every gap and have a complete text eventually.
So it'd sort of be like, I'll use the Bible just because the audience might be a little more familiar. So if we had a Genesis chapter 1, let's say, wow, that is really cool. Sorry, I don't know if you heard that sound just then.
No.
There was this ringing sound. And I looked up, and it's because someone gave us a super chat. And I don't know if you know what that is, Jana, but it's somebody donated $5 to the channel, and it pops up on the screen now. So, and I always read it in a funny voice because I have problems. So I don't know how to read that. It's 5 pictures of hearts with arrows going through them. So I'll try to do it. Yeah, so at tea with Sue Loretta Schindler for $5. Thank you, tea with Sue Loretta Schindler. She has 5 hearts, each with arrows going through them. I suppose they may have evolved from a single heart. Okay, I'm here to help. So I will explain quickly for our guest. There's a gentleman by the name of Kent Hovind, who is a bit of a character here on YouTube, and anyway, and that's his voice. He has a very distinct voice, and he argues against evolution all the time, and so the audience likes me to read it in his voice. Sorry, it's always very jarring when I do that to the guests. So I'm sorry. But if we were to go back to Genesis 1, and let's say we didn't have a Bible like we have now, right? We just had 6. We went through a library, and the library had burned down, and we went to the Bible section, and we had the remains of 5 different Bibles, and a bunch of the pages were burned away, but then there were little fragments left. Well, we would go through all those Bibles to the first page and see Genesis 1 there, and maybe the top half of the page is left, the rest is burned away, and maybe the bottom half of another page remains, and the top half is burned away, and maybe the middle, it remains in another one. And what you would do then is you would take all of those pages, and you would write out what's on this page, and then you would write out what's on that page, and if they overlapped at all, you would line them up. And that's what Jana's describing there, creating a score, because in the same way that you would go find burned pages of Genesis 1, she's looking for all the different clay tablets that have any piece of this particular composition, written on it, and she's trying to line those up as best as she can, so that as much as possible, so that we can get as close to a complete text as possible. So that's really good.
That was a brilliant comparison. I'll steal that if I may.
please do.
Explain to people what I'm doing. I'll say, think of Genesis.
Yeah, right. Awesome. So, so I have my questions here, if the audience can't tell, and so I'm just kind of looking. You've answered 1, 2, and 3, which is fantastic.
1. Oh, I'm sorry. We're going through them too quickly.
No, this is perfect.
Actually, people keep asking me when I talk about, and then I go to museums, and sometimes I find new fragments. They're like, how do you find new tablets? Because obviously they're not arranged like a library, and you can just go and kind of pull them out of the shelf. And that's actually been the most exciting part of my research, or that side of my research, because sometimes I started actually with the list of manuscripts that was compiled by Miguel Civil, a very, very eminent professor of Sumerology at Chicago University. So he's done most of the job of identifying all the little fragments that you were talking about. So I'm very indebted to his work, as is pretty much everyone who's working in Sumerian literature, because he hasn't just done this for this one text, he's done it for many, building also on the work of others. But
if I could, Jan, I just want to tell a very quick story that I heard.
Yes.
And I think it was from Paul down there that I heard this. And I hope I don't mess up the details too much. But talking about Miguel Civil, who passed recently, which was extremely sad, because he was a brilliant mind. But to give you an idea of how brilliant he was, there's certain people that are working with a different deck of cards, let's say, mentally, a deck of cards that I don't have access to. He was at Chicago, and I think it was John Taylor that was in the British Museum, and
Mhm.
he had a tablet that he was working on, and it was a little fragment, like a corner, and he couldn't figure out what it went to, and which signs should be reconstructed immediately after it. And so he called Miguel Seville up and said, "Listen, I've got this fragment. It's got like 4 signs on it. Here's what they are. It's the upper left hand corner. Do you have any idea? Because I'm sort of running out of options here." Now Miguel in Chicago says, "Are you in the tablet room?" He says, "Yeah," and he goes, "Go to drawer 156593." He says, "Oh, okay." So he walks over and he pulls it out and he says, "Do you see tablet BM 956284?" And he says, "Yeah." And he goes, "Put it in the upper left hand corner. See if it
No.
fits." And he goes, "Oh my gosh, it does. How did you know that?" And he said, "In 1973, I was looking at that that tablet, and I could never find that corner." So, yeah.
That's a very humbling story.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to say it's like legend has built up around him, but you know what? I don't think it's legend. I think that actually happened.
Wow.
So yeah. Anyway, so that's Miguel Seville. We're all very, very indebted to him for the work that he's
Absolutely.
done. I'm sorry for interrupting you. Go ahead.
No, not at all. Well, I was so proud of my kind of tiny, minute stories like that. It's just nothing against it, obviously.
Sorry. Audience, forget
um,
what I just said. There is no Miguel Seville.
well, the thing is, just maybe to put it into context, when I knew my text fairly well, so I started out with cuneiform tablets that had already been published and that I had access to, be it photographs or drawings or something like that. And then once I knew my text pretty much by heart, because I've been working with it for some time, then it was not too difficult to identify even small fragments.
Mm-hmm.
But I just had this one text in my head and not 50.
Your text, though, is
So,
extraordinarily difficult. I mean, there's those debates are extraordinarily difficult. Maybe do you want to talk about the genre just a little bit? Because I think the genre is
absolutely. Yeah,
actually very,
yeah.
very
I haven't
exciting.
talked at all about what the text is about. I just
That's
kept
all right.
saying it's really fun and exciting, but I didn't disclose why. Um, so we do have quite a big genre, kind of subcorpus of Sumerian literature that is literary disputations or literary debates. So they're more or less in dialogue form. And the usual setup is that 2 rivals engage in some kind of a verbal contest about who's either more relevant or who's better at a given task. So in my case, it was 2 women. That's why it's called 2 Women Be. And these 2 women engage in a fight about who's the better housewife. That sounds quite soapy and ridiculous. But it obviously tells us quite a lot about housewives 4,000 years ago, because this text was in all likelihood composed at the beginning of the 2nd millennium BCE. So it is about 4,000 years old. And why I personally found that so exciting is because housewives never show up in the record. They do their daily chores. They look after the family, the children. They do a lot of work, and whenever the housewife is not present, lots of things go wrong. Nothing much has changed. But nobody writes about them because what they're doing doesn't happen on a large administrative level. It doesn't need any writing. She just does it, and nobody needs to keep any records about it. And normally, when we're thinking of ancient literature, it's mostly written by men because men are the ones who get the scribal education, and they also don't write about housewives. I mean, that is a relatively modern thing to be writing about ordinary people and not kings, heroes, supernatural beings, gods, etc. So we don't have any narrative texts, no epics or anything about ordinary women. We have no day-to-day documents about women, but we have at least 2 literary debates between women. So there are allegedly 2 women fighting, and they're mentioning all the things they should be doing, etc. So this is pretty much the only literary text that mentions housewives' work 4,000 years ago. And that's why it closes quite an important gap in our knowledge, because before we could reconstruct and translate and understand these texts, all we could say is, oh, well, we know what housewives do. Housewives have been doing the same thing for millennia. But that's as far as we could get. Yeah, we could just think like, well, okay, what does a woman do? Well, a woman marries, a woman has children, looks after them, cooks, whatever, and then looks after grandchildren and then dies. But everything, all the concepts or ideals connected to them were never voiced, and they were voiced in these texts. So there's more than one of these debates between women, but only one of them is pretty much completely preserved. So the rest are just unconnected fragments. That's unique. And then after that, until the end of the cuneiform culture, this never happened again. So it's this kind of snapshot. For a very brief period, they did consider housewives worthy of literary immortalization, and then that was over again.
And there are lots of different types of debates. And for those of you that have been following along on the channel, you're probably familiar with the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature, ETCSL, and when we do our Digital Hammurabi book clubs, that's usually where the viewers follow along. But if you go to ETCSL, and the link is usually in almost all of the video descriptions of our videos, but if you go to ETCSL, there's an actual subsection called debates, and you can read, not obviously all of them, but there's a select few: summer and winter, hoe and plow, copper and silver. Is that? Yeah.
Bird and fish.
Yep.
Sheep and grain.
Yep.
Yeah, lots of these things. Yeah.
And so what you end up seeing, and then sorry. So what you end up seeing is 2 things, as Jana said, 2 things that are debating with one another. Like the hoe versus the plow, and the hoe is talking about all the great ways that he can do things, and the plow is saying, whatever, you're nonsense. And the hoe says, oh, look, your teeth fall apart when you plow. You're so weak. At any rate, and then at the end, a deity judges to determine the outcome, who wins. And then we have 2 scribes that debate one another, Enki Mansum and
Nirinisa.
Yeah, there it is. I always forget his name. I always want to call him Dwight, but it's not Dwight ever. So, but but no, it's really fascinating. Now, I wanted to ask you this. So, and you brought this up somewhat, not in passing, but I just want to kind of come back to it. You said that these debates, and in particular this one, were written by men.
Mm-hmm.
So, do you think that this represents? Sorry, we got another super chat. I'm going to read that in just a minute. Mm-hmm. But do you think that this is, how accurate of a representation do you think this is of actual women's lives? And I know this is going to sound sort of crude, but I feel like this is what people would understand. If you read erotica written by men, a lot of times if they're writing from the perspective of the woman, it's not always terribly accurate, right? They're trying really hard to write from a woman's perspective, but how much of that do you see going on here? Do you think that is that something that you considered as you worked through this?
Yeah, very good question. So maybe I should go back a bit further, because you just mentioned the other debates between summer and winter, bird and fish, hoe and plough, etc. That's maybe another thing we could talk about later. But what's quite interesting about them is we have all the manuscripts from the same period that my manuscripts come from, so the early 2nd millennium BCE. But for these types of debates where you have two different protagonists who have something in common but are still distinct. So summer and winter, obviously, seasons, and bird and fish are animals, but one is flying, one is swimming, etc. So they're different in some crucial ways. For them, we have evidence that they go back further in history. So there we have evidence that texts like this, of this type, must have existed already at the end of the 3rd millennium, and perhaps even before that. And they were performed as little theatre plays at court. We don't have actual texts from that period, but we have them mentioned. So they're a bit different, but they seem to be some pretty traditional Sumerian genre, precisely because they were used to entertain the king already at the end of the 3rd millennium BCE. And my understanding of the other two types of debates, namely between schoolboys or scribes and women, is that they are later adaptations of that genre for a very particular purpose, which is to teach schoolboys Sumerian rhetoric, how to engage in a debate, and also define kind of job profiles in a way. So there, the setup is slightly different. It's not a farmer and so an animal breeder and someone kind of agricultural work, or two different profiles, like I don't know, a scribe and
a leather worker,
an ox herd, or something like that, who said, like, okay, well, I'm teaching future generations, and no, I'm providing you food. Who's more important? It's not that kind of thing. They're equal. They're both doing the same job, and it's all about who's better than the other. So there, it's more about competence. And so they were used to teach the students various things. I said already, they were used to teach them Sumerian as a foreign language, and they used to teach them rhetorics, but especially the disputations between scribes also contain long lists of what a scribe should know and what he should be able to do. So he should know Sumerian, he should recite it, pronunciation was important, handwriting, of course, had to be beautiful, they were supposed to do well at mathematics and such things. And then women were defined as housewives, basically. So that was their job, their profession, in a way. But at the time these texts were written, and I don't think they have a long history going back, but they were actually written around, say, 1900, 1800 BCE. Ordinary women, the kind that is portrayed in this text, they didn't speak any Sumerian anymore because they were never sent to school. The girls were taught by their mums, I suppose, how to do housework, but they normally didn't attend school. There might have been exceptions, but generally it's boys of families where there are already scribes that send their children to school and not girls. So all these texts kind of originate from this intellectual milieu of scribal education to which women normally didn't have access. And no women at the time would have understood what the two female protagonists in the text were saying. So that's one important indicator, actually, that this was composed by men who still knew how to compose text in Sumerian and who could read them and write them and memorize them and copy them down. So I think the whole framework is the scribal school, to which not even every man had access. It was just a few, basically. What I also found interesting, so I wrote quite a big chapter on the ideal woman that is being conceptualized in the text. And in order to get a more balanced idea, I also compared it wherever possible to these dialogues between men, between scribes, between boys. And one thing that really struck me was that when these two women, they keep insulting each other and telling each other, you're doing all these things wrong. And we can talk about maybe what defines an ideal housewife in a minute.
That's question 6.
You're doing it wrong. You can't do any of the things you're supposed to do. You're completely useless as a housewife. Just be ashamed of yourself.
That's
you can't
rough.
really call yourself a woman. You fail at being a woman, basically. And lots of these insults or reproaches, it's kind of difficult sometimes to distinguish between the two, mention husbands. So you don't please your husband. You don't do this for your husband. You don't do that for your husband. You're treating your husband badly. One is accusing the other of being infertile. So, and then this woman's alleged infertility is immediately linked to her entire household, her family, and how that her infertility affects the entire family negatively. So a woman is basically, a good woman is defined in relation to her husband. And the same never happens the other way around. So we have accusations of impotence between men. They say like, oh yeah, you can't do anything. You're a really bad scribe, but also you can't do the other thing. And wives are never mentioned. So obviously if someone's impotent, that has effects on a future wife or whatever, but that's not mentioned. Or if they're poor, it's not mentioned that they can't take care of their family, for instance. Whereas when women come from a low social background, that is immediately linked to how this affects negatively her family. And the other thing I found interesting is that children aren't mentioned, which is really weird because you would think that women spend a lot of their time raising children. And it is kind of mentioned indirectly, but never as much as how she's treating her husband. So I thought that's quite indicative of from whose perspective these texts are written. They don't even care about how she's treating their mutual children. It's all about whether she's, cooking his favorite dinner.
Right. We probably shouldn't be laughing at this, but
well, gosh. I guess not. Yeah,
no,
I guess it's sad, but
yeah, man.
So yeah, to maybe wrap up what I've been now trying to explain, and I don't know how many minutes. I'm sorry for that.
No, this is wonderful, Jana. Thank you.
That you, how do I put this more concisely? I don't think it's completely misrepresentative of ordinary women's lives at the time. So many of the things we encounter in the text make sense in the way that a woman was supposed to cook for her family. She was not allowed to buy any fast food. She was supposed to make all this herself, but she was also not supposed to give any service to others outside the family. So a woman really should be at the service of her own family and to no one else. She should have certain character traits. She should be humble, diligent, caring, etc. She was responsible for her family's clothing. So obviously they had to produce all their clothes themselves, which is quite a difficult task. And all these things aren't very surprising, and they do sound like what a housewife should have been doing 4,000 years ago. So I don't think in that respect it's very misrepresentative, but especially when it comes to services for the husband, which also, of course, include pleasing the husband sexually. It's not just about bearing children, which is important, but also there are many lines that actually refer to sex just in a pleasurable way and not just immediately linked to having children. And she should be pretty and healthy and all sorts of things. That does seem to reflect certain male expectations about women.
Yeah. It is really interesting. And I think that from a, more of a historical perspective, when we try to get into aspects of the ancient world, seeing these sort of laser-like illuminations on a particular area, while it may seem sort of maybe not trivial, but mundane to people outside of the field, it's almost like another peg that we can hang more information on and paint that, get a picture that's more clearly painted. So yeah, it's really interesting to listen to how you interacted with the text like that and thought it through. I wanted to ask you, so I'm going to ask you a question, give you a second to think about it. I'm going to read this this super chat after I do. And if you haven't encountered this, it's absolutely fine. By the way, everybody, we're coming up on 45 minutes. So if you have questions for Jana, please put them in the side chat, tag me at Digital Hammurabi, and we'll ask them. But I don't know if you've ever looked into Proverbs 31, the sort of the ideal woman. Okay. So if you could be thinking about that for a minute, I just want to know, what are the similarities, and are there any big distinctions that you see?
Yeah.
So Vibrantly Brantley for $5. Thank you, Vibrantly. Okay. The super chat sound is only an example, micro evolution in live streaming, and does not suggest this mutation will improve a channel. Skylar Fiction. Yeah. So hopefully, if you've never seen a super chat sound produce a non-super chat sound, well then that's fine. But don't use taxpayer monies to support your religion. Jana, I promise it's funny.
Of course.
Of course it is. It sounds psychotic when I listen to it, but yeah, I'm sure it's funny. No, go ahead.
Are you done?
Yeah, I'm all done. All done.
Proverbs 31. Okay, good.
Okay, good.
Yes. I'm actually really happy you brought that up, because I think it's quite illuminating. So I'm sure your readers probably are more familiar with the Bible than me, but I did read that section. And it's in praise of the reliable, the capable housewife. And many of the themes we encounter there, we also encounter in my text. So providing clothes, for instance, she's portrayed as constantly being busy with the spindle, etc. Providing care for her husband. I think also Proverbs 31 is clearly written from the perspective of a husband.
Really?
But the main difference is that the ideal wife is defined through praise, right? She is being praised for all her positive qualities. And it's the exact opposite in the Sumerian texts. We never find a single positive word about any of the female protagonists. Perhaps because it's the setup, it's a contest about who's better, and still it is a bit surprising maybe that they never say, oh, well, I can do this, you can't. No, it's just attack. It's just constant attack, putting the rival down, saying, you can't, you fail, you fail. And they never showcase their own, positive qualities or their expertise or whatever. So that's very peculiar. And there is no complete Sumerian text ever praising a good woman in the way that Proverbs 31, and I think there are some other sections in the book of Proverbs as well, does that. What does that mean? Do they think of women badly? I mean, it has been suggested actually most prominently by Miguel Seville that Two Women Be is one text of a misogynistic tradition in Sumerian literature. And I've been thinking about this quite some time, but I think the main corrective to that idea of misogyny is the fact that the same is happening in dialogues between men. So when scribes fight about who's the better, who's the more competent scribe, they also just keep attacking one another. And they very rarely say, I can do it better than you. It's comparatively rare. And another thing is, there is a nice recurring rhetorical question in my text. So the way it's designed, so they have like a short kind of confrontation in the beginning where it's a very natural conversation which leads up to the real quarrel. And then they each have speeches of like 8 to 10 lines. And then they finish their speech with a particular, often a question actually, or some summarizing statement to signal the other speaker, now it's your turn. So it's quite ritualized actually. They don't just, it's not a natural dialogue. It is in speeches. And they like, or at least one of them, the one who wins in the end, likes to end his speeches by asking the other, ironically, and you? Are you a woman? ? And of course the implied answer is no, you're not. I mean, she's just enumerated all her faults. And then she asks, so this is what you can't do. And you think you're a woman, you're clearly not. So that's obviously quite fun and quite drastic, because it implies that if you can't do these things, you're not a woman. But on the other hand, if you flip it round, it also says that whoever can do these things is a woman and is a good woman. And in other texts, not in Two Women Be, but in other texts, there is quite some appreciation for wives and mothers in particular. So there is some praise of women in general. So I'm actually, part maybe from the inequality that we have resulting from the situation that only men normally can read and write. So they have the means to compose such texts about men and about women alike, and women can't really participate in that particular written discourse. That's of course unfair in a way from a modern perspective, which might be a bit anachronistic. But like real misogyny is relatively difficult to pinpoint in Sumerian texts. And if you're thinking of other texts, if you're thinking of some Greek writing, if you think of Pandora, like all evil is associated with women, and Hesiod can get super misogynistic. And the same in some Christian writings as well, where it's all traced back to Eve making the biggest blunder in the world, and that's then kind of goes down in all generations of women, where it's all connected back to the sin that Eve committed. You don't find such generalizing statements, negative statements about women in Sumerian literature. So I don't think there is a misogynist tradition in Sumerian literature. If you were doing your job good, if you're doing it well, then you were a woman, and women were okay, apparently.
And women were okay. But yeah.
Necessary. They just had to do their stuff right.
Oh, man. All right. Well, we do have several questions. So 123 Goober P, that is a fantastic name, asks, how does the debate format compare with Socratic discourse?
Well, that's a good question. So generally, the Sumerian dialogues don't try to really solve a philosophical problem or a question. And in the dialogues I'm talking about, we don't have this teacher-student format. So obviously, there's quite a bit of dialectic going on, but it's more of a rhetorical verbal contest. And ultimately, it's about who can just argue better, who is more skilled at attacking the opponent, forming their arguments in a more coherent way, which is already the same between summer and winter. And there it's quite clear that there is not a philosophical problem at stake. For a yearly cycle, for a seasonal cycle, you need both. So it's completely stupid to ask who's more important, summer or winter, or bird and fish. It's like literally comparing apples and pears, right?
Right.
You can't tell which is more important. So the joy in these Sumerian debates is about observing who is arguing their case in such a way as to eventually convince a judge. But normally the judgment always has one line about, you're actually both important, so don't worry. He's the better speaker. Winter could present himself in a better way, or Plough was more skilled at rhetorics, but that doesn't mean we don't need Ploughs anymore. Just because Ho won the verbal contest doesn't mean we're not kind of discarding all Ploughs and we're kind of telling summer never to make its appearance again. One thing though about Socratic dialogues is often about it has this ethical component about what is being good, how do we lead a good life, and that question does occur in the text, the dialogues between human protagonists. They do ask the questions: what is it to be a good wife? What is it to be a good scribe? And it's not just about professional competence; it's also about character traits. It's about being humble, being modest, being diligent, etc. So there is this component to it, but the general framework, I'd say, is quite different.
And one of the sort of secondary results, and I'm assuming it's secondary, but it could have been primary. If everybody remembers, these were produced in scribal schools, and one of the things that happens when you go through these texts, as Jana knows better than anybody here, is that your vocabulary increases exponentially. And so if you're dealing with summer and winter, now you're talking about all the different lexemes that deal with seasonal changes and harvest. And so that vocabulary, which was exceedingly important for a scribe to know, debate between two metals, debate between bird and fish. Now you're getting into all the different vocabulary when it comes to metals and metalsmithing. You're getting into fish and fowl and all the vocabulary there. And of course, that's I suspect to be a significant part of doing this. So yeah, that's great. So C. Conlin, and I'm sorry, my eyes are terrible. I think that's the name. Is the text written in MSL?
Wow, you've got some very well-informed people there. Yes, so it's not entirely written in MSL. So MSL, for everyone who maybe doesn't know, is a specific socio or genderlect, one could even say, of Sumerian that is spoken by female speakers in literary texts. That sounds a bit bulky, but basically it doesn't have to be women. It could be goddesses who speak MSL in literary text, in myths or something. If a goddess is speaking, or in poetry, she would normally also be using MSL. So it's a variety of Sumerian that is distinct from the official Sumerian that men are also using when male characters are speaking in literary texts. So whenever the women are speaking, they do use MSL, which is also important because they're never introduced. So it's really just direct speech. There are no narrative passages whatsoever. There is no short introduction setting the scene, saying, and then Mrs. so-and-so met Mrs. So-and-so, and they engaged in a fight, and here is what happens. None of that exists in the text. So it's from the first line, it's direct speech. And actually, for a very long time, it wouldn't be clear that we have women speaking if they didn't use 𝑀SR. But then, of course, something actually a quite exciting aspect about the text, which I haven't mentioned yet, the quarrel gets so out of hand that it ends very abruptly, and both women have to kind of go to court to settle the dispute. So then a male judge enters the scene.
Of course.
It has to be settled by someone senior, and it ends up so what happens, one woman slanders the other as being a whore. So because both women are married, that is an adultery allegation, and adultery is one of the chief crimes a woman could commit. It can be a capital offense. So the law collections are quite clear that if a woman is caught as committing adultery, she can be killed. She doesn't have to be necessarily, but that is one of the punishments for adultery. So it's quite serious if you, accuse someone of adultery. And then word seems to get round, and the husband of the accused woman hears about it and immediately divorces her, because of course he doesn't want to be married to anyone who might have been unfaithful. And this poor woman who says, no, I'm innocent, it's just this evil neighbor of mine who's slandering me. She then goes to court and says, listen, judge, this is what happened. She's already on the street, apparently, so she can't appeal to her husband anymore. And you need to find an authority for both women equally. So that's why the judge and the city assembly all come into play. And there are several male speakers there. Again, it's only direct speech, no narrative passages, but from the way they address each other and from the presence or absence of 𝑀SR, you can work out who's speaking and if the speaker is a man or a woman.
I'm just picturing the male judge saying, let's be rational.
So cliche, isn't it?
God, it's like, I'm glad it's not 1954 anymore. That's all I'll say. Because if I had to be like in charge. Anyway, so I'm just glad I have Megan to be in charge. I'm just half kidding. All right. 123 Goober P asks again, what do you both think of the theory that biblical Tower of Babel refers to loss of schools teaching cuneiform? I have never heard that before. Jana?
Me neither. So, I don't think I can answer that question.
Yeah, I have to say that a lot. Yeah, I have to say I don't know. I'll look into that. That's sort of a catchphrase. It should be the catchphrase of the channel. All right, so we have one more question, and then I think we'll probably wrap it up because we're right at an hour. This is from Frustrated Atheist. Are these courtrooms the time frames version of reality TV drama?
As I said, it does to a modern reader, and surely also for the ancient audience, which mainly consists of schoolboys, did have some kind of soap reality drama aspects, because first of all, you witness two women fighting. You can just see them tearing out their eyes. And then it ends at court, and it's quite a complex court case because slander is, of course, quite a tricky crime in a way. And then the judge pronounces a first verdict, but then someone apparently makes an appeal, saying no, not quite so. It's quite complex and unfortunately a bit broken at that stage. But it looks like in the end, the woman who has been slandered is cleared. And we can actually link it to the Law Code of Hammurabi, where there are several provisions for different cases of adultery. So if I'm correct in connecting it with a specific paragraph there, might actually be able to go back home to her husband, but it's not entirely clear. So there's a lot of drama going on, certainly. And I'm sure these texts were not just kind of very, educational, they were also very entertaining. Yeah. I'm sure they had a lot of fun, especially also because I haven't quoted any of the insults, and I probably shouldn't be doing that on the internet, but they're quite bad. Yeah. They weren't shy of, bad language at all. So I'm sure these boys would have had a lot of fun reading these texts and learning all these swear words, etc. But the main motive for these texts is didactic. So from this quite elaborate ideal court case, it's like an ideal slander court case with all the different things that can come into play. I think the main reason for why the text ended that way was to teach students how to behave at court. So it was, in a way, preparing them for different careers, perhaps even. So how do you make a prosecution speech? How do you make a speech for the defense? How do you find a verdict using, like, whatever, if it's the law code of Hammurabi or other sources, because they did study these texts at school. They did study law, and not just contemporary, but also older law course. So how, maybe it was designed to prepare them for being a judge. Like, this is possible, yeah. So I think the main impetus was didactic. But of course, it's a lot nicer and perhaps more effective to frame all this in a fun and exciting, dramatic, emotional story, rather than just having, a text. So if one woman slanders the other of adultery, then this is what you ask them, this is what you do, these are the paragraphs. That's quite boring. I think it's easier to remember and easier for the boys to relate if they have some kind of story around it. So didactic reality drama show.
Nice.
But at the show, the one thing I haven't really mentioned is that, especially in the second part of the text where we have the court case, I think that would just be ideal as a theatre play. I've collected various text internal indications for the text potential to be actually performed on stage.
Oh, wow.
So I could very well imagine this as an actual drama being acted out by schoolboys, because nobody who doesn't have a scribe education could follow this anymore. I don't think there were any public performances, as there might have been earlier when people could still understand Sumerian. But then that would have been hilarious, because the two main protagonists are female, so
maybe
two boys would have to
maybe they were Gala priests in training. Maybe that's who did it.
And they're the ones who speak MSR, right? So maybe they were kind of made fun of at an early age. I think it would have been really quite fun for everyone involved. And I mean, this is not so far from modern didactics in a way, right? You learn by doing it, by playing it, by acting.
Well, this has been absolutely incredible. We have one more super chat that I'm going to read, and then Jana, I'd like you to, if you have a YouTube channel or a Twitter handle or a book that you'd like to plug to advertise, please get ready, and we'll put links for any of that stuff in the description of this video. 123 Goober P for $6. Thank you. Thank you both. Really enjoyed this chat, smiley face. Yeah, we enjoyed it too. It evolved into something fun. Okay, now I'm here to help. This is not my wife. It's a picture of her. That was, there's so much to explain. Just so much to explain, Jana.
I guess.
So please, before we close out, do you have a publication that you'd like to recommend to the people of yours, or follow you on Twitter? Or
I'm afraid I don't use Twitter. I did write a short piece about my dissertation, but kind of, I don't know, I can give you the link if anyone's interested, but I think I've probably talked about all of it. I'm currently preparing my dissertation for a book manuscript. And that's going to appear in kind of academic German series. And I'm afraid my dissertation is also going to be published in German. But I am considering, or I will start looking into it, whether I will keep it separate. I will have kind of German scholarly academic text edition and perhaps really a second short book in English on the construction of the ideal woman in Sumerian didactic literature. So I can't really give any details for that yet. My dissertation is going to be published with De Gruyter at some point. But I guess that's not the kind of reading your audience is looking for. Ideally, one day there'll be the other book as well, but I have not actually, I can't confirm anything about that yet.
Well, if you write it, please give us the details on it. We will promote it here because I can promise you that.
I mean, I have some short articles. I don't know if that's relevant, but I think what would be nicer would be the actual book out there.
Yeah, please let us know. We will we'll make sure we get it out to everybody. Well, thank you so much, Jana, for coming on. This has really been a lot of fun, and
for me too. Thank you for having me.
It's so nice to have when we have guests that come on. It's always nice that they're of a very high academic quality, and I know the audience really enjoyed it. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And we will see you guys next time. Thank you for watching. You had about 55 people watching regularly, Jana, so that's pretty good. So thank you all very much. And until next time, remember, resist poor scholarship. Always ask, how do you know that? Bye, guys.